Planning a fishing trip shouldn't feel like a full-time job. With fishingbooker.com, you can find and book the perfect fishing trip within minutes. Fishingbooker.com connects you with trusted fishing captains around the world. Booking is fast, easy, and secure, with access to verified customer reviews, loyalty rewards, and around-the-clock customer support. Everything you need to book with confidence is in one place. So head to fishingbooker.com and start planning your next fishing adventure today.
For some people, the outdoors is a hobby. For others, it's a lifestyle. Torque wheels are built for the ones who chase sunrise on the water, track game through the timber, and spend weekends towing boats, campers, and ATVs to the next adventure. With a full lineup of wheel sizes and fitments for trucks, SUVs, vans, trailers, and RVs, Torque wheels are made to match your lifestyle and your rig. Wherever you go, whatever you haul, go with confidence. Visit torquewheels.com to find a retailer near you.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the core and culture of fly fishing. Here on the 403rd episode, we're going to do things in a very different direction. We're talking about fly fishing downstream. Now, I want to make it very clear at the forefront of this episode that the vast majority of my fly fishing and the vast majority of your fly fishing should be done upstream. Why? Well, there's reasons from both a mechanical and an approach perspective. From an approach perspective, this keeps you out of the fish's vision. It also keeps you from disturbing anything that may interfere with your presentation to that fish. From a mechanical standpoint, it's just a lot easier to make a good presentation and to manage line if you are fishing at an upstream or upstream angled across direction. It's just common sense. It's the way that physics work, and it is the way that most fly fishing is intended to be done. But there are times, there are situations, there are circumstances, there are obstacles that force you present your fly downstream. If you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, we're going to talk about three scenarios today where a downstream presentation may be advantageous. It may even be the only way you can make a presentation to a fish. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why that might be the case and some of the things that you could potentially do to get your fly into a good position and then actually have a chance to hook, fight, and land that fish. Which brings me to my first kind of caveat. There's two of them. One has to do with line management. The real problem with fishing downstream is line management, and this feeds into a number of things. It feeds into something as simple as setting the hook. We'll talk more about that in a second. But it also, you're in a situation where you either have not enough slack out of your rod tip, and so your fly is going to drag. It's actually going to be moving slower than the current, or it's going to be stagnant in the current, and it's not going to present an accurate imitation of an insect. That's the first one. Or you're going to have too much out there, and a couple things could happen if you have too much line out of your rod tip and you're fishing downstream. One is that you will not be able to set that hook because there's too much slack in between your rod tip and that fish when it takes because you have too much line out. The other one is that if you have too much line, you're actually going to be dragging because your fly line is going to be moving at a quicker pace than your monofilament or fluorocarbon leader and fly, and then you have a big mess on your hands. If not dragging, then potentially you have your line kind of butting up against or piling up against your leader and fly, which can just be an obstruction for that fish seeing your presentation. It's going to just mess the whole thing up. You also have issues if you're fishing streamers. When you strip that line out, is that line going to be pulling downstream as you are pulling upstream? So again, we'll talk about a number of the particulars of line management, but it's just, I think, probably the biggest problem that you're going to encounter when you are making presentations that are downstream. The second one, as I alluded to earlier, is setting the hook. With setting a dry fly or nymph, or even some streamers or a wet fly a presentation, you're going to do a trout set. because you are fishing for trout, at least in most circumstances that we're talking about today, which means that you're going to lift that fly rod relatively laterally while maintaining tension on your fly line with your line hand, which is all fine and good. However, if you are making a downstream presentation, the direction at which you would be pulling that fly is the exact same direction that that fish's mouth opens. So there is no perfect way to set a hook on a fish if you are making a downstream presentation. The best you can hope to do is to set that hook to the side. We're also going to be talking about fly fishing in situations where you are fishing into an obstruction. So for an example, there was a place I fished into a bridge, under a bridge quite frequently, and it was impossible to get 3/4 of the way down underneath that bridge and then make a trout set, because the fly line would then go up against the bottom of that bridge, which was a very abrasive concrete. So not only was I losing tension on that hook set, but I was probably damaging my fly line. So it was about a very, very sharp and lateral hook set. Now, sometimes you have the benefit of a very aggressive take. So you're fishing a dry fly like a hopper or something like that, and the fish crashes and turns its head. And when that happens, you can set the hook however you want. There's a good chance the fish has already hooked itself. Once you start playing it, it's going to apply that necessary pressure to make sure that hook point stays in there. But if you see a take like that, or if it's a very aggressive streamer strike where that fish is coming at that fly and it's already turned around and it's facing downstream by the time you have an opportunity to set that hook, then you're golden. But if it's a more delicate streamer take, or certainly a traditional dry fly take, or it's a fish it's just going off to the side and biting a streamer, or excuse me, a nymph, then you're going to have to act with a little bit more finesse. Now, I will say, if you're fishing with an indicator, you have the benefit of the fact that that indicator is probably moving past where that fly is when that fish takes the fly, and so you actually have a little bit of a fulcrum with that indicator on the surface of the water, so that when you set the hook, it is going to pull it more up and down than back towards you, but ever so slightly. But that could be enough to give you the benefit of setting the hook into that fish's mouth. But I just want to throw that out there. That's going to be the two things that you're going to be fighting with the most. If you are going to go through the trouble of making that downstream presentation, you have a lot of things that you're going to have to work with. However, you are going to work with dealing with line management and setting the hook are, I would say, two of the biggest things. So anyway, all that to say, let's talk about the three of the reasons why you would want to make a downstream presentation. The first one is obstructions. It's either a obstruction over where you're fishing, so a bridge, a culvert, a canopy of trees, or something that is on the side. So I'm thinking of a stream that I fished that had a little side channel, and high water, it would all be one stream with like a little kind of shallow gravel bar. But for normal flows and low flows, it got diverted into basically two little streams with kind of a little ridge of rocks running in between them. And you could cast into that little side channel, but your fly line would be on top of rocks if you were to do that, or up against grasses later in the season once the foliage had an opportunity to grow up. So the best way to make a presentation into this little side channel was to do so from upstream. You say, well, why didn't you go to the other side and do it? Well, it was a sheer cliff. That's why I couldn't do it. But you go to the other side, go from upstream and make that presentation downstream. Again, so whether it be a obstruction from the side or an obstruction from the top, there's times where on some of the spring creeks that I fish frequently, there is a lot of streamside vegetation that, as the season goes on and as things go to seed, those plants basically create a little tunnel that runs along the stream bank. And so it's not even a matter of trying to get your fly in the undercut bank. It's getting your fly anywhere near the bank that requires a downstream approach, because there's like a 18 inch to 2 foot barrier between you're accessing that stream bank and standing in the middle of the creek, created by this bent over vegetation. And of course, there's pockets here and there, but not enough where you can make any sort of good presentation. Again, I suppose we'll use a hopper again as an example. If there's a fish that's violently feeding in a window, you can shoot a tight little cast into that little window, and that splash and that maybe 6 inches of drift is going to be all you need to get that fish to strike. But for a prolonged drift with any kind of fly, then fishing down through this tunnel requires an upstream approach. And so again, with a dry fly, let's use a hopper. A hopper allows you to have a little bit more flexibility, because what's a grasshopper going to do in the water? It is going to twitch. It is going to move. It is going to swim with little fits and starts. And so you get upstream, you make a cast. You don't just drop your fly in the water. You get far enough upstream, one, that you're not right on top of where you want your presentation to start. You are still making a cast to these fish. And then I like to use my rod tip to wiggle a little bit of line out. I like there, and again, this is by feel. I like there to be nice, gentle S curves in my line. They're not 6 feet wide; they're maybe 2 to 3 feet wide. As that fly floats down, but I'm not allowing more line to get out of my rod tip than I need to maintain a drag-free drift, and also to keep that fly on line, on target with where I want to present that fly. And so I will wiggle that tip of that fly rod, allowing line to kind of come out of my my line hand slowly. I'm controlling it in both of these ways to allow that presentation. And then, if at all possible, I will try to allow that fly to swing over to the far extreme of one side of the stream. And I can do a couple of things. If I'm fishing a bridge and I'm fishing in the middle of that bridge, then I'll drag that fly or pull that fly, trying to pull it into a back cast so it doesn't pop or create a big disturbance in the water or a wake, but just pull that fly kind of against the bridge abutment so I'm not disturbing the fish that I've not yet caught. And if it's something like that little canopy created by that bent over vegetation, I'll actually drag that fly underwater back into the main channel of the stream, pick it up, make sure it's going to float again, and then make my next presentation. Again, when you're fishing something like a hopper, you have the benefit of being able to give it those twitches and those wiggles. And honestly, outside of the most dainty mayflies, I'm okay with doing that with a fish that's going to be in a situation like this. They're there because they know that they have safety and they know they have food. I'm not causing it to necessarily swing 18 inches laterally in the current, but if I'm giving it a little bit of taps, or it's getting little taps because I'm wiggling that fly line out of my rod tip and I'm 25, 30 feet upstream of it, I'm not going to worry about that, especially if it is a terrestrial or caddisfly or a bigger stonefly that might skitter a little bit on the water. So that's the first reason why you might want to make an a downstream approach. You're upstream, the fish is downstream. The second one is dealing with wonky currents. Now, there are times where you are going to be able to cast and mend and compensate for the currents being a little bit funny. I'm thinking of a local tailwater where you're standing in 6 feet off the bank of a 35, 40 foot wide creek, and to make a presentation to the opposite side of the stream, you're dealing with like 4 major currents, including some that are almost at a standstill because they're behind a rock or on top of a big depression in the water. So there's times where you can make that cast, but once again, you've got a relatively small opportunity for a drag-free drift before one of those other currents starts to really rip your line downstream, and now your fly starts to drag, or best case scenario, just gets pulled skittering across the surface of the water. Now, you should be able to mend your way through some of that. This is not, one difficult current. This is multiple difficult currents, or one incredibly difficult current that would necessitate moving upstream and making a downstream presentation. But here, if it's just currents and you have open water, then you have a few benefits. One of the things that I like to do when you have, no canopy, your rod tip can kind of go wherever it wants to go. Similar thing, you allow that fly to drift downstream, and you can raise your rod tip to maintain to maintain tension on that fly line, but also it's another kind of wiggle-free way to allow line to come out of your rod tip. So you're gently releasing fly line with your line hand, raising that rod tip up, not so high that now you can't set that hook, but maybe going from like directly out in front of you to a 45-degree angle. You're gently doing that, dropping it, and then repeating the process to allow line to go out. Now, we haven't really talked about fishing nymphs, but this would be a situation where that might be a really good approach, is to fish a nymph into a current that you couldn't otherwise access by casting across the stream as you would typically do. Now, here, urinating is virtually impossible because you're having a tight line would create a pendulum that started wherever you dropped that fly, and then it just swung up to its a terminal point as the fly moved downstream. Which, I mean, you can catch the fish that way. There's a lot of insects. I'm thinking of a number of our major caddis species, which are going to rise up in the water column like that. If you're going to have some sort of caddis pupa that has a air bubble on it, it'd be a perfectly fine way to fish, where you just make your cast, you allow that fly to move through the water column and back up towards the surface. That's a great way to present the fly. But if you want a more traditional approach, then this is where using a strike indicator is really going to benefit you in a lot of ways. One, it's going to function the way that we like to use strike indicators for, which is a bobber. And you're going to see that fish take, and now, regardless of how much slack you have out, you can pull down on with that line hand, pull up on that rod hand, and you're got yourself into a fish. But what this also is going to do is, as you allow line to go out, maintaining those smaller S curves, when hopefully you're not getting like a 60-foot drift here. We're talking like a 20 to 30-foot drift. But that strike indicator is also going to anchor your line to the water, so you're able to wiggle a little bit of that line out of your rod tip as that fly and as that indicator move downstream without making that fly move too much. But honestly, as long as it's not dragging, if it's just kind of moving up and down in the water, I don't think that's going to be a particularly nerve-inducing thing for most of your trout. So first circumstance is an obstruction overhead or on the side. Second situation would be if the currents are really, really tricky and you're having a very, very hard time making a cast. Another situation where this might be the case would be if you are on like a tailwater or even on a larger mountain river where you can't get to the other side for whatever reason, whether it's the topography, whether it's the access, and there is a big, fast run in between you and the other side of the stream. And so where you're able to access it, you might only be able to fish into that really fast water or fish directly downstream of you. And so that would be another situation where the current would necessitate a downstream approach. Third one and last one for today, because we're at 16 minutes, is it's just the only way you can approach the stream. And that's kind of what I was talking about a moment ago. But there's a number of kind of canyon rivers that I've fished where you're just unable to access the water where it would be a safe approach, or in a way that would not put you right on top of feeding fish. And so your approach may necessitate a downstream presentation. It could be that it's so thick, there's so much thick vegetation and that riparian area right up against the stream bank that you just can't get in the water. I've fished a couple of mountain streams where there is access, but it is incredibly slick, and you're in this precipitous kind of a series of waterfalls, and I don't want to approach from a downstream angle. I'll approach from an upstream angle and make my presentation downstream, because I would rather make the angling difficult and not my, hobbling back to the car more difficult because I've sprained my ankle or broken my leg or something like that. So you may be in a situation where to get into a position to make any sort of presentation of that fish at all, you're going to have to do it from upstream. Downstream may be super deep. It may be super silty. It could be that there's other anglers that are there. And again, you don't want to fish downstream to kind of get around the ethics of allowing people to have their fish, but it could be that accessing the water in that spot may put you too close to other anglers, which again, that's a not a hard and fast rule, but that's something to use your discernment. And so honestly, if it feels like it's on the edge but you still feel like you can make presentations of those fish, then that's a situation where you could do it from upstream, facing downstream. But don't be afraid to make those downstream presentations if one of these three situations presents itself. I found too that there's times where my accuracy, and again, this really kind of gets back to the currents issue, my accuracy can be increased by making downstream presentations. Setting the hook is going to be a lot trickier, but there's a couple of streams where I fish evening hatches, like into the nighttime, and the strikes are so violent and they're so consistent, they're so splashy that I'm fine positioning myself upstream, and slightly off of feeding fish, and basically making a cast directly to my left, so that even though I can't see the fly, I know precisely where that fly is on line. And then when I hear that splashy rise, then I give it a beat to hopefully that fish's mouth is closed, and then I will lift that rod tip up and kind of over my left shoulder. So if I'm standing in the river is flowing from my right to my left, I will try to get so that the fish is feeding downstream of me, but about 10 feet in front of me. So basically a rod tip's length. And I will make that cast, make sure there's enough slack, hold my rod tip high, and then when I hear that big splashy rise, I'll make that hook set kind of back and over my left shoulder. And in doing so, one, if that fly was not what my fish ate, it quickly got that fly out of the water, started dragging in front of its face. And if it is the fly that that fish took, now I've hooked up, hopefully in the right corner of that fish's mouth, not just pulling it straight out of its mouth. So again, approach and line control, dealing with currents, dealing with a difficult situation, an obstruction in this situation, which is not being able to see what's happening. So there are plenty more approach and presentation tips for fishing downstream. I'll throw this one in there. I've mentioned it before. If you haven't heard it, then this is something I've talked about a lot. One of my favorite approaches for fishing spring creeks and fishing undercut banks is to allow a streamer to bounce along the bottom, but maintaining some tension with my line hand. And so I'm feeding out a little bit, and when I'm feeding that line out with my line hand, I'm raising that rod tip up like I talked about already, and then I'll drop that rod tip down and allow that streamer to drift down a couple more feet, and then do the same thing, feed out a little bit as I raise that rod tip, so that streamer is kind of going up and down slowly against that undercut bank, up against the side of the stream as it moves downstream, and then I'll drop my rod tip down and do slow, quick, tappy kind of jerky retrieves to pull that fly back to me. I love this. It gives that fish two opportunities to see that fly. As the day goes on, you realize the fish may be more into that dead drifted streamer than they are in that retrieve streamer, or vice versa. And then you can adapt that retrieve and approach across the entirety of that stream, not just up against the banks. It's interesting, different times of day, different water temperatures, they will be more aggressive, or they'll be much more apt to take the exact same fly, but with a little bit of action, dead drifted, as opposed to retrieved as you would traditionally retrieve a streamer. But that's another downstream kind of presentation, not necessarily approach. All right, questions, comments, thoughts, want me to clarify anything? I know talking about presentations, talking about casting is a little bit abstract. You have to, visualize it, but hopefully this will give you some ideas to not be afraid of doing this. But again, I don't get in the habit of this. This is more of the river has necessitated, the positioning of the fish has necessitated that I fish this way. And it's just a reminder that you're not going to make a presentation or an approach to every fish perfectly. It's just not going to happen. Even the best anglers are going to be limited by the natural world that we're in when we're fly fishing, which is fantastic. It's a great thing about fly fishing, is that even the pros, those doing it for a long time, are going to be stymied by some of the puzzles that fish throw at them. This week on Casting Across, the first article was called Propellers and Light Angling Heresy. I was at Bass Pro Shop with the boys, as I'm wont to do, and we're looking around at lures, and I found the original Pistol Pete. And these are flies. I mean, they are flies, but they got a propeller on the front. And so this article is a little bit about where we draw that line. This may be very offensive to some people, a fly with a propeller on it. Well, a lot of people are also offended by mop flies, squirmy wormies, egg patterns, beads, things like that. Where do we draw the line? So that's a question I'm asking. Where do we do it? All right. Wednesday's article is called Video, the Longest Fly Fishing Book, in which I show you for 7 minutes Ernest Schweibert's Trout, over 1,700 pages, but it is a very good book. I highly recommend it. So definitely check that out. If you have a copy, awesome. If you have a first edition, phenomenal. If you have a signed first edition, that's a pretty good score. But you can find it online. You just got to do a little bit of looking, and you should be able to procure yourself a copy of Schweibert's Trout. This week's recommendation on the podcast isn't a product. It's something you have already. It is a recommendation on how you can rejuvenate, give second life to one of your insulated water bottles. So if you're like me, you have a lot of insulated water bottles. And if you're like me, they get dented, they get scratched, and the paint starts to chip. And now this beautiful bright orange Hydro Flask or Yeti or whatever it is now looking a little bit rough. And the stickers have been through the dishwasher a bunch and all that sort of stuff. All you got to do is wrap it in paper towels, put it on top of a piece of aluminum foil, pour nail polish remover on it, and then wrap it up in the aluminum foil and kind of make sure that that nail polish remover has saturated and moved all around that paper towel. And after 15 minutes, almost all of that paint and all of the stickers is going to come right off. So now you have a stainless steel bottle, probably still has some scratches, probably still has some dents, but it is much more appealing, and you have a brand new canvas for a bunch of your fly fishing stickers. So this is something you can find online, but something that I had to look up. And so now you have to look it up. You heard me talk about it. But yeah, give that a shot. And if you have a Casting Across sticker, you can throw that on there and everyone will say, hey, you listen to Casting Across. What in the world's that? Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app, rate the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, place, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.